Welcome everyone who has managed to join us to another UK section hybrid event hosted here at Anglia Ruskin University. We are absolutely delighted to welcome Jess Kerr, who is a loudspeaker designer and a graduate from Anglia Ruskin University, graduating in 2015 rather. Jess went on to found Kerr Acoustic, who design and create high-end loudspeakers that have found great commercial success in both studio and high-end consumer markets. And I have to say, if you're joining us online in the Cambridge area, you've missed out because these things sound amazing and we get to listen to them and you can't. So over to you, Jess.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Jez Kerr, founder and managing director of Kerr Acoustic Loudspeakers. As Steve points out, I graduated here at Anglia Ruskin in 2015 and officially founded Kerr Acoustic in 2017. It's an honor to have been invited to come and speak here today by the AES board. I must admit, I didn't know a great deal about the nature of these talks and these events prior to being invited to speak, and originally just assumed I was going to be speaking on a prescribed topic. And it was after agreeing, that I learned that I'd actually have the freedom to speak on basically any topic of my choosing. So I had to come up with a title, and a synopsis, and found myself drawing a little bit of a blank. It's kind of difficult when you can choose anything. And it's often easier to be creative when you're working within limited parameters. And I don't do a lot of this sort of thing. So I didn't have anything prepared, prior to being approached. But, the very kind invitation landed during a particularly busy week. So I rattled out this title and the synopsis, which you might have read, and thought, that's probably a topic I can get my teeth into a little bit, drawing on some experience that probably, fits the bill for this kind of event. And then a few weeks passed. And when I sat down to actually start, preparing a talk and putting it together, I read it back and I thought, God, that's dull and, contentious, and it's probably already been sort of done to death. And, I was reading it and thinking, oh, I'm nodding off already. So, I'm not going to be doing a load of, really sort of tedious in-depth analysis, pulling up loads of graphs and data, showing peak loudness curves, ranting about how many LUFS Spotify recommends for uploads these days. And I'm also not going to be condemning, sound bars and Bluetooth speakers, ranting about, Dolby Atmos and waxing lyrical about how music was better in the 70s. That's all been done to death. And I don't have, a slideshow showing how music consumption habits have, progressively changed over time, which hopefully, comes as some relief. But I am going to talk a little bit about my experience in this field and what I've observed and found through my experience in both the professional and high-end domestic audio industries. And we are going to have a little Q&A section at the end. So I'm more than happy to, dive into the meat and veg of it, if anyone wants to get into any specific topics afterwards. So yeah, but I do think there are, some interesting topics, surrounding this, and to explore, really around, the topic of music consumption on a human level, how we're listening to our music, how we're engaging with it, and what we're getting from it, and how we can learn and perhaps understand a little bit more about each other's music consumption habits. So by way of introduction and, to give you a little bit more information about my background, I've always been, a fanatical music fan. And music collector. And to me, it's been always, a basic fundamental need to have music around me. Plants need sunlight, oxygen and water. I need tea, music and a resolving hi-fi system to listen to it on. And music has really always been, fundamentally at the core of pretty much everything significant I've done in my life so far. And I grew up in a very musical household, dad being a guitarist, mum being a classically trained opera singer. So I was exposed to, a lot of very diverse music in my younger years. I got taken along to a lot of rock gigs, opera recitals, and there was always music on at home. Sony Walkman on the go, out and about. If there wasn't music playing, something was wrong. So time passed, and I grew up through my teens with a kind of lofty dreams and ambitions of being a rock star. I think as many of us do. And I took up the drums, just to be annoying. And went through most of the various kind of band phases. Was lucky enough to do a little bit of touring around Europe, drumming in metal bands, jazz outfits, worked with a few folk and country artists, and then ended up joining a really quite busy, active touring glam rock band. Wore the eyeliner and everything. It was, yeah, a lot of fun. Please don't try and find any videos online. I know they're out there somewhere, ready to come back and haunt me. But it was a lot of fun and a very formative experience. And then I was lucky enough to start getting involved in the world of session work. So resultantly found myself in a lot more recording studios and started to really enjoy being in studio environments, not just behind the drum kit, but in the control room as well. So the nice thing about being a drummer and being in a recording session is that you do your tracking first, get all the hard work done and out of the way in the first few days, and then your time's your own, while everyone else is putting their parts down. And I just loved being in these studio control rooms, learning about all of the gear, the microphones, the signal chain, observing the tracking and mixing process, and just drinking it all in like a sponge. And all of these experiences I was having were impacting, informing, and shaping my experience and understanding of music, not just as an art form, but as a creative process, and also as a science as well. And I gained awareness of a lot of the critical decisions that go into creating a piece of recorded music, all the way from pre-production through tracking, mixing, mastering, release, and then marketing. And suddenly I had this window of insight, into the creation of music from the other side, and it was really exciting. And I dabbled a little bit in music production myself, which formed a very large part of my, a large component of my degree. And went on to engineer and produce a few albums with artists I was working with. And all this time, kind of in the background, I was tinkering away with loudspeakers in my spare time, as they were always just an object of fascination to me. How could you send an electrical voltage to a box full of magnets and paper cones, and get a saxophone out of it? I always found that kind of magic. Here at Anglia Ruskin, I was able to make the contacts and connections that gave me the initial support and encouragement to start seriously thinking about the prospect of founding a company to make loudspeakers professionally. And via the medium of essentially an 8-year investment of application and learning, Kerr Acoustic is now, I'm pleased to say, a globally selling premium loudspeaker brand with nearly worldwide distribution, multiple award-winning products, and essentially it's still a one-man company. So I basically manage and oversee all aspects of running the business, from assembling the speakers to packing the pallets up for shipping to traveling overseas to represent the brand at trade events and exhibitions and stuff like that. And of course, designing the products, which is where my kind of true nerdy passion lies. So that's a little bit about me and my history. So to get into this whole notion, of how music is consumed, and whether audiophiles are onto something, admittedly, a little bit of a contentious title. And I think the eyebrow raiser really is the use of that word audiophile. And I think the word audiophile means different things to different people. And I think we need to dig into the definition a little further before we can really contextualize it and think about it objectively in this context. So I think to a self-confessed audiophile, and I include myself, in this category, it's somebody who has a deep interest not only in music, but also fundamentally in sound, and the nature of sound and the reproduction of sound. And to me, it's somebody who has aspirations of experiencing music and reproduced sound in a more engaging way than the typical music consumer. It's somebody who will make an occasion out of listening to an album, kind of sitting down right in between the speakers, TV off, make sure everything in the hi-fi system is set up, just perfectly, and listen, and just listen, for the experience of listening. Then there are the more obsessive types of audiophile who will, rigorously compare 4 or 5 different vinyl pressings, of the same album from different eras, different countries, just to see which one sounds definitively, the best copy. And admittedly, I confess to falling into this category as well. And then, completely on the flip side, there are those who see audiophile as a bit of a dirty word, and including some who actually kind of fit the criteria by dictionary definition. People who perhaps work in sound and have a passion for audio, but that tend to associate the word more with sort of audio snobbery, see it as being a bit elitist, and something to distance themselves from. I think to them, they think of the word and imagine, perhaps a bearded, bespectacled man, in his late 50s with his cables on little pylons, kind of all around the room, speaker cables that cost more than some people's cars, perhaps a separate mains feed, coming into the house with a dedicated, filtered ring main just for the hi-fi. And they view this behavior as just entirely unnecessary, kind of extravagant, and take the view that, if they don't need that kind of gear in the studio when they're making the music, then you definitely don't need it at home to listen to it. So, there's a few definitions, and I think, to me, the word is more encompassing than that, and really describes anybody with a passion for audio, with a passion for sound, who appreciates hearing recorded sound played back at the highest possible level that they can experience. And I think that really covers, such a broad demographic of people, across all generations. And, folks who I think sort of scowl at the term, are often very dismissive, of the notion of the so-called audiophile equipment, that costs thousands or tens of thousands of pounds, and maybe has a slight sort of audio jewelry association. And we do see the word being used in branding quite heavily these days. And my usual advice would be to somebody, if you see the word used in the branding of a heavily mass-produced, clearly very cheap and commercial product, to run a mile, basically, with a few exceptions, of course. But I feel like, for fairness, I kind of have to disclose my position on this, which is, and I know this may seem like a little bit of a cop-out, but I genuinely feel as though I have a foot in both camps. And that's come through having had, experience in both the professional audio space and also in the world of high-end domestic audiophilia. And honestly, I've learned a lot from both. And I think they could probably learn a little bit from each other. And sometimes it's a shame to see, a lack of integration between them. So, on one hand, I've experienced the virtues of the ultra high-end, kind of ultra extreme, lavishly, presented audio playback systems running up into the hundreds of thousands of pounds, sometimes with, shall we say, quite sort of esoteric pieces of equipment in the signal path, and been absolutely blown away. Full suspension of disbelief. I'm in the room with the performers thinking this is as close as I can possibly get, so being there, with the original performance, and you genuinely feel like you could just reach out and touch the musicians, to use a cliche. But equally, I've had some of my best and most impactful and formative listening experiences in studio control rooms, with big soffit mounted monitors in the walls, connected up with twin and earth mains cable, being fed by old PA power amplifiers and inexpensive, DA converters at the top. So I try and keep as open a mind as possible when it comes to different playback equipment, and try not to dismiss something based purely on preconception before, kind of actually listening to it. The trouble is, I've also had some truly awful listening experiences, with sometimes with extremely high-end audio equipment in terrible acoustic environments. And unfortunately, this is something I encounter sort of more often than I'd like to in the world of high-end domestic audio. I have this sort of now quite tired analogy that I always revert to, that I'm sure everybody who knows me is probably sick of hearing by now, but I always say that to assess the performance capability of an audio playback system, you know, in a horribly tuned or sometimes perhaps not even tuned at all acoustic environment, is the equivalent of assessing the performance of an F1 racing car on a muddy farmer's field on a wet day, you know, somewhere in Wiltshire. You know, it's just so important to get the room right. You know, if you're serious about playback, because as long as you're listening through speakers, whatever you're hearing is always going to be a product of both the playback system and the environment itself. And they're both as important as each other, and they have to work together. If you're listening in an appalling room, no amount of audiophile branded cables and cryogenically treated fuses and mains plugs, you know, is going to save it, because you're just not getting the fundamentals right. And in those scenarios, the priorities are skewed. Now, of course, studio professionals know this. And to them, you know, the fact that anybody who considers themselves into audio would question this, you know, is almost beyond comprehension. Yet sadly, you know, I do often see and hear ludicrously high-end, you know, hi-fi systems set up in spaces, sometimes floor-to-ceiling glass, no attempt to control the acoustic characteristics of the space by way of treatment or soft furnishings. And I think this is where some of the frustration, you know, can start to creep in. Sometimes in these setups, you sit there and you're listening, and you think, I'd rather be listening to a pair of old Wharfdale Diamonds, you know, being powered by a NAD 3020 or something from the 80s in a more acoustically optimized space. So yeah, if there's one axe I have to grind in this whole, you know, topic, it's that I don't think enough attention is given to the importance of acoustic room treatment in high-end domestic listening environments. And I think that's one area where the audiophile, you know, community could benefit from taking a leaf out of the studio professional kind of handbook. And gain real tangible improvements in, you know, perceived sound quality without necessarily having to break the bank by buying that latest bit of kit. You know I might be potentially doing myself out of some sales by advocating that viewpoint, but I do feel very passionately about it, and yeah, believe very strongly in the importance of, you know, getting the listening environment suitable first and foremost. So yeah, back to this notion of sort of being an audiophile. If we look at one of the comments that comes up a lot, it's the comment of they're using music to listen to the equipment rather than using the equipment to listen to music. Now, there's definitely some truth in this, especially at things like hi-fi exhibitions, you know, trade events, dealer demos, and private listening sessions. You know, of course there is. You know, if you've got this interest in the gear, and curiosity to see how it stacks up against other bits of gear, then you're always going to fall into that sort of analytical comparison mode. You know, and when you're in that mode, it's almost like the gear and the music have almost switched roles. But of course, you know, the ultimate goal you have in mind when going through this process is to end up with a playback system that allows you, as a music consumer, to be able to just fully enjoy the music and eventually switch off from analysis mode, stop worrying about the equipment, and just get totally immersed, you know, in the recording. You know, and of course there are different tastes, you know, when it comes to playback equipment, much as there are different tastes in music. And really, I think it all comes down to the user's own personal goals in terms of how they want to experience and engage with their music. So, you know, at one end of the scale, you know, in one camp, you've got people who, you know, want to hear everything kind of absolutely warts and all, you know, no embellishment. They essentially want to hear what was coming out of the studio monitors when the recording was being made. And they'll probably opt for, you know, maybe a more neutrally voiced chain of audio components in their playback system. Now, they may get truly reference level monitor-like precision when playing back recordings, but those systems naturally aren't going to be very kind to subpar productions, and will expose poor recording quality, poor mix quality, you know, for what it is. It will shine a spotlight on it. So the folks, you know, who fall into that camp, I think, can sometimes end up restricting their own musical diet somewhat, even if they're not consciously aware that it's happening. And sometimes, you know, end up with playlists of incredibly well recorded and well produced pieces of music that sound absolutely amazing, you know, on their ultra revealing hi-fi. But woe betide, you know, they throw on their old favorite punk album, you know, that they grew up with as a teenager, which, you know, is on a modern, accurate and revealing system is just going to sound like a bag of nails tumbling down into a quarry. So, you know, there's a balance to be struck, maybe. I remember having some very crucial early experiences learning that a super duper high-end hi-fi system isn't necessarily going to make your music collection sound amazing. I remember being about 12 and visiting one of my dad's friends, and he was a total hi-fi nut, and you know, I was really eager to see how my Limp Bizkit CD would sound on his, you know, mega super duper hi-fi. You know, he had speakers bigger than refrigerators and amplifiers that looked like they'd drain the national grid of most small countries. And so I was really excited, you know, and I remember just being so utterly underwhelmed because it didn't sound any better than it sounded on my Iowa MIDI system back home in my bedroom. In fact, if anything, it sounded worse because the mix was just so crushed, and that accurate system was revealing that and essentially just shining a spotlight on it and exposing it for what it was. But did it stop me loving the album and continuing to blast it, you know, at home on my Iowa MIDI system? Well, of course it didn't. You know, I carried on listening to it and you know, loved it just the same. So I guess, you know, in an ideal world, everything would be superbly recorded, mixed and engineered to the highest standard, you know, from beginning to end. Maybe there'd be a standardized set of sonic criteria, you know, that each commercial recording would have to meet in order to be released, and everything would just sound fantastic. We wouldn't need such a range of differently voiced pieces of hi-fi gear to be able to, you know, enjoy it, and everything would be a lot more standardized. Sounds kind of boring, doesn't it? And this is where, for me, fundamentally as a music lover, the content of the music is always what comes first, and the recording quality is secondary. And if I love the music, I'll find a way to enjoy it. You know, and whether that's playing it back on a high-end system, blasting it in the car with the bass pushed all the way up, you know, because there's no bass in the master, or just, you know, casting it to the Apple TV while I'm pottering about the house. You know, I'll find a way of being able to consume that that allows me to engage with it. And I have various bits of kit, you know, come and go in my own hi-fi system, and I generally tend to kind of veer towards having more of a preference for more neutrally voiced equipment. And when the hi-fi is in sort of neutral mode, that's fine, because, you know, I can still blast the less well recorded stuff, you know, in the car, or have it on in the AirPods, you know, while I'm doing the washing up. You know, and if I'm enjoying it, you know, if the content of the music means just as much to me consuming it that way as when I'm listening to the best recordings, you know, on a reference system, it still means the same. So, you know, where does that leave those who, you know, want to be able to enjoy all of their music collection, you know, even the terrible recordings of music that they love, on their fancy high-end hi-fi system, you know, all the time? And I think, you know, maybe that's where some of this slightly more esoteric, you know, less well understood, more boutique equipment, you know, can start to come in. And the thing is, I think, you know, the attraction for those individuals with a preference, you know, for that kind of equipment, you know, and that kind of flavor in their playback system, in almost all cases, it is still fueled by a genuine love of music, and really wanting to be able to enjoy, you know, all of their music on their hi-fi, you know, and not just the super well recorded stuff. And in those systems, it's about more than just compensating for poor recordings. It's about allowing you to really appreciate the art form, maybe in a slightly exaggerated or enhanced way, you know, that's increasing your enjoyment of it. You know, maybe it gives a slightly warmer rendition, maybe puts a slightly rose-tinted filter over the recording, you know, but if it's for the sake of enjoyment, and it's you know, making that music go from unlistenable to highly enjoyable, then why not? So, you know, often in these types of systems, you know, we see a lot of valve stages, you know, when we know that transistors are less noisy, maybe systems where vinyl is the primary playback medium, when we know that digital has a lower noise floor and a higher dynamic range. And yeah, they might be using, non-standard fancy cables, with altered capacitance and altered impedance characteristics, and I mean, why, what's it doing? Well, this is where we sort of, fall into slightly kind of debatable territory, but my opinion is that a lot of it is actually about adding harmonics in the analog domain. And our ears like harmonics, and a chord on a piano always sounds more satisfying to our ear than a single note. In some cases, maybe some of these pieces of equipment and analog playback mediums are even perhaps reintroducing some of those natural harmonics that were present in the original performance, but have been lost, during the various stages of capture and production. Now, look, I know we're getting into highly contentious territory here, and full disclosure, I don't claim to be an expert on the science behind these sorts of theories that exist, but I do know that given the choice, having had a lot of experience with all different types of music and systems, at home I'd almost always choose to listen to vinyl, through a valve phono stage ideally. And it really is about more than just the physical experience of putting a record on a turntable and holding the sleeve, and having that whole kind of experience. But could I live, without the convenience of streaming services? Absolutely not. And it would make my job incredibly difficult if I tried to. Would I survive without my AirPods in the gym and the Bluetooth speaker out in the garden, on a summer's afternoon? It almost doesn't bear thinking about. On my desk at home, I've got some old Bose Acoustic desktop speakers with the matching sub under the desk, because it's there for background listening. I'm not looking to do mastering on that system. And equally, I'm not looking to be distracted by how amazing something sounds and how much it's pulling me in and engaging me, when I'm trying to get on with some work. And more importantly, I don't want to be, kind of feeling disgusted by how poor the production is of a particular track that I happen to really enjoy listening to while I'm getting on with other things. I know no matter what I play on them, it's going to sound equally mediocre. It's a level playing field, so I can enjoy a range of recordings in the background and everything will sound satisfactory. And then contrastingly, I'm exhibiting at a hi-fi show in Bristol this forthcoming weekend. And I'll be giving demonstrations of the loudspeakers. And I've just finished updating and compiling a demo playlist. I think it's currently up to about 140 tracks. How many of these tracks would necessarily be on my sort of go-to, listen purely for the love of music sort of playlist? It's probably less than 10%. And these are demo tracks, for a reason. They've been recorded, mixed, produced to an extremely high standard, mixed to be played back on highly resolving systems with high dynamic range. And they're superb tracks for showcasing the performance, performance potential of the playback system, which is really useful, when you've only got a few minutes or perhaps half a song, to convince somebody that your equipment is worth listening to, and maybe worth investing in. You need something that's going to impress them. But to caveat that, I always encourage anybody who's seriously thinking about investing into a piece of high-end kit for their hi-fi or for their studio, to try and make sure you can get an extended commitment-free trial to see if it's something that you can actually live with long term and not something that's just going to sound amazing for 5 minutes in the showroom. And I absolutely include my own products in that as well. It's something you have to live with long term. So and I think often of commercial music releases within the construct almost like a Venn diagram, with exceptionally well recorded, dynamic and sonically spectacular tracks in one circle, and then the other circle containing music that I just genuinely love, for the music itself. The lyrics, the melody, the energy, and to be honest, the crossover in this Venn diagram is often surprisingly small. And occasionally there's a release that falls right in the middle. A good example of this being Peter Gabriel's most recent release, I.O., which funnily enough has actually been released in two different versions, two different mixes, I guess to suit different tastes and assumedly different types of playback system. But they both sound great, and it's just one of those albums that just ticks every single box, from the songwriting to the recording, the production quality, quality of the mastering and the physical medium itself. The pressing is just fantastic. And then, an example at the complete other end of the spectrum, one of my absolute all-time favorite bands is Cardiacs. Hands up, any Cardiacs fans? No. It's a bit of an acquired taste, but in my opinion, one worth acquiring. If you listen to their albums, on a ruthlessly revealing, neutrally voiced, balanced system, it's honestly like taking razor blades to your eardrums. The mixes are utterly mushy, smeared. The layering and separation, between the instruments is just all over the place. But I think it's partially a conscious stylistic decision, from a production point of view. It's a creative decision. That's how they've wanted it to sound, but some of their albums are just so grating, they're almost unlistenable on accurate systems. But do I want a super high definition, ultra super duper remastered version where all the levels and the spatial positioning of the instruments have been changed, probably by somebody who wasn't present for any part of the original recording and mixing process? Not really. But do I want to be able to listen to it on a system that makes it listenable so that I can just really crank it up, cathartically sing along to it, as long as there's nobody listening? Absolutely, I do. And for me, some of the slightly more esoteric, boutique equipment that I've been lucky enough to have in my hi-fi system over the years has allowed me to do that in a much more engaging way than perhaps, more neutrally voiced, maybe even more sterile sounding equipment would have allowed. Because it's not the quality of the production, in these cases that I fell in love with, it is the music itself. And any piece of equipment, that sort of gets me closer, to enjoying that and feeling involved in the music, and brings back those memories, of first hearing a particular track, is doing its job as far as I'm concerned. And thankfully, we live in a world now, where there's equipment to accommodate all tastes and all levels of investment, from your TV soundbar to your £1 million hi-fi systems and just about everything in between. And I think that's something to celebrate and something to be grateful for. So really, that's, a little look into, I guess, the world of audiophile music consumption, what it means to be an audiophile, to me at least. And hopefully there's been one or two interesting bits in there to take away. So thank you very much for listening. And thank you to the AES board for kindly inviting me to come and speak here today. And I'm very happy to take any questions that anybody might have.
One in the room, please. Speak loud.
Over to you, Bill.
Everyone can hear you.
You might have to repeat the question unless you can hear me.
I'm not sure. I'll ask out. It's louder.
Okay, so I remember years ago teaching students audio and playing some really great music to students, and them being absolutely floored at the music. And I remember a student specifically saying to me, "Why do we not get to hear music of that quality now?" So I know you get to play lots of music to lots of people, I think around the world now, right?
Yeah.
And what is the reaction when you get people hearing high quality music on high quality loudspeakers or a system?
Yeah, the reaction of the listeners. Well, it can obviously depend on the level of experience that the listener has with high-end equipment, with good rooms. So a lot of the trade shows and events that I go overseas and up and down the UK to do are being very well attended by people who are already well into this, and who kind of maybe have a high-end system of their own, and have just come out of another room next door where they've been listening to probably an equally high-end good sounding system. So a lot of them are kind of braced for a good sound. But there's something about the look on somebody's face, particularly when it's your product and you put it on, particularly if it's a track maybe they've requested, and you just see that sort of smile start to appear. We call it the grin factor. And that's a wonderful feeling, you know, to get that result and that reaction, you know, because it's knowing that on a human level, you know, your product is enabling somebody to engage, you know, with music, with, you know, with their preferred art form. So it's a great feeling for me. And yeah, I always enjoy seeing people's faces light up when I get to, yeah, play something on a good system.
All right, we have a question from one of our viewers online. Let me just find it. This could maybe lead on to a further discussion, but very straightforwardly, do you have access to a Clipple NFS sort of loudspeaker testing facility?
I do have access to testing equipment. I have my own testing equipment, which is comparatively quite limited compared to a fully fledged Clipple system. But I have friends with AP systems, which are of course, you know, very, very high standard industry systems. And yeah, I have on occasion taken a product there, you know, have them, you know, kind of measure it and take a look at it. And I'm, you know, I've always been pleasantly, you know, kind of surprised to see that, oh, great, you know, it measures up well. That for me is not the be all and end all of designing the products. I think, you know, measurements are important, particularly if they're relative measurements. And, you know, obviously this is something, you know, that is factored into the design process. So yeah, so that equipment is out there and I have access to it, you know, when I need it. But I don't find myself needing it as often as you might expect. I'm perhaps a little bit unusual in the sense that I do almost all of my design by ear. So almost all of the tuning is done by ear, and I might do some relative measuring sometimes just to check and make sure that, you know, that what I'm hearing is being backed up by the numbers and that I'm not sort of, you know, in my own head and going on a wild goose chase. But no, it's certainly handy to have access to that kind of equipment for sure. Yeah, it's very useful.
Thank you. I guess just generally to finish off that question to anyone online or in the room, is anyone aware of a Clipple system in the UK? Blank looks and silence online. Yeah, that's that question. Another question coming in. What are the demographics of people who buy your gear? Over time, will the market be dominated by music mixed for phones and sound bars?
Yeah, that's a good one. So the demographic for my loudspeakers is surprisingly broad, particularly overseas. I find there's a wider range of people starting to engage in hi-fi. I think a lot of that has to do with, you know, perhaps the vinyl revival and the, you know, the interest that's come in physical music releases again through that. So I'm probably split approximately 75% high-end domestic and 25% studio in terms of my client base. And I, as I've said, enjoy, you know, working and interacting with, you know, both of those markets. And again, you know, within each of those markets, you know, the demographic can be quite broad. So, you know, I'm currently in the process of finishing an install for some quite well-known UK rap Afrobeat producers in central London, who are a great bunch of guys, and I really enjoy working with them. And that's something I'll be able to talk about publicly soon. You know, and then the next day, you know, I could be at a hi-fi dealer doing a demo event, you know, and it's all sort of, you know, kind of grey bearded chaps swilling their brandy, you know, sort of stroking their mustaches, which is great. You know, it's to have that variety, I think, you know, be able to come from yeah, sort of, you know, from one you know, one field, one sort of yeah, one group, and just, yeah, and for them both to have equal appreciation for the products is great. Now in terms of mixing for Bluetooth speakers, sound bars, all that kind of thing, there's no doubt it's happening, and it's being factored in to the creative decisions, you know, that are basically driving a lot of commercial releases these days. And I think that sort of stands to reason. You have to be business minded about it. You have to look at your target demographic and how they're consuming their music, and sort of mix accordingly. So it's not something that I personally kind of have a big bugbear against, but the market is changing. But what I'm pleased about is that there still is this awareness, that high-end equipment is out there, and if you want to invest in it, you can, and I think that awareness is hopefully starting to grow a little bit. Hopefully that kind of covers it. But yeah, happy to dive back in if not.
Right, thank you.
Bill.
I just wanted to ask if you kind of design your loudspeakers to have as flat a frequency response or a manufacturer's frequency response that suits a more of a domestic environment, because you said you're selling to 50% studios and 50% hi-fi enthusiasts. So is there a difference, or do you make them bespoke for who you're selling them to?
Sure. Well, at the beginning, I mean, the design goal was very much, I want to make studio monitors, I want them to be accurate, flat, super linear. I thought, that was the expectation, and that was, what I needed to do, basically. And yeah, that was the market really that I kind of, started trying to attack first on. So yeah, there is of course this whole notion, surrounding speakers, especially monitors, about needing a ruler flat frequency response and trying to get it as linear as possible. And to have that as a kind of objective, constantly kind of, at the back of your mind when designing a speaker, that's not a bad thing to aim for. I soon found, through doing my own research and design, that a completely flat frequency response isn't always necessarily what you want. And that goes for, at home and in the studio. And this is, personal opinion, because it's so hard, isn't it? What is a flat response? You're always going to be measuring and listening to a product of the room you're in and the speakers. And even in a lot of recording studios, where you've got speakers that are designed to be, as fundamentally flat as possible, you measure them in the room, even if it's a really, really good room, and you're still going to be, sometimes perhaps relying on like a Trinov or a room correction system or something, to make compensatory adjustments for, for the sound you're getting. And in my own design, I found that, when I was kind of more heavily investing my energy into the sort of more measurement focused design work, I'd find that by swapping a few components around, I could make a response look a lot flatter, but rarely did it actually translate into a more realistic listening experience. Oftentimes I'd suddenly be aware of things that I, kind of wasn't, didn't really want to be aware of, and not in a kind of, oh, that's good, it's a monitor, it's exposing, what it should be exposing kind of way. It was more like just, kind of annoying little kind of resonances and things. And, you start to think, okay, well, look, it's about what can give me the most realistic, and engaging experience, whether I'm mixing, or listening for pleasure, and so, yeah, so again, I think it's a good objective to aim for. I don't consider it to be the most important and the most fundamental thing in the design of my speakers. They are reasonably flat. They are definitely more linear than a lot of the, kind of high-end commercial loudspeaker products that are out there. They definitely have, as many have said, a quite the sort of, studio characteristic in their voicing. But to me, whether they sound right and they make instruments sound right is more important than how they measure on a graph. So that would be, yeah, my thoughts on that.
Okay. Jess, you suggested a playlist. So the question is, are you sharing this playlist?
I certainly can do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe, what sort of form does it take at the moment?
It's on Qobuz, so that's just one of those streaming services that's lossless full res source files. So I think it's publicly shareable, so I'm happy to share that.
We'll sort the details out. Maybe it's something we can post along with the talk when it's uploaded to YouTube or something like that.
Yeah, great.
Excellent. Right, I'm going to read this one verbatim.
Okay.
And
bracing myself.
The go between.
Okay. Sure.
All right, here goes. I agree that different playback systems may serve different purposes, and we can listen to both the music and the sound. What I object to is when people with high ideals are taken advantage of because they are ignorant of physics.
Right.
And when people develop the delusion that there is more in a recording than is actually there. The recording is a product of its circumstances, nothing more. Any comments?
Yeah, I mean, good comment, you know, good question, you know, and yeah, I think granted, you know, there are some highly questionable, you know, products and devices out there, you know, designed to supposedly enhance your listening experience through various, you know, pseudo-scientific means that often aren't underpinned, you know, by the science. And I'm not here to, you know, justify those companies advertising and selling those products. You know, that's for them. You know, I don't personally endorse, you know, kind of a lot of these really kind of highly questionable products myself. But I have to balance that by saying, you know, if it works for you and as the end user who's, you know, experiencing and buying those products, if it's enhancing your experience, then kind of no further justification is required. Like, this is about our own personal subjective experience at the end of the day. So yeah, I try not to sort of look down my nose too much at anybody that's using products that work for them. But I do take the point and understand the point that's being made.
We have a reply. It reads, if it works for you, question mark, the emperor's new clothes.
Well, there we are, you know, and it's yeah, that's I think this exists in any hobby, doesn't it? You know, you get into this kind of realm of you know, kind of questionable pseudoscientific kind of stuff, but hey, look, I'm not here to judge. I respect those that are and that do. Yeah, you know, nothing really further to add, but yeah, I again understand the chap's objection to some of the equipment that's out there, and do support some of those sentiments myself.
Perfect. Received with thanks.
Okay,
anyone for any more?
Well, I'll just make a comment actually, is that I actually had a student do a test on you know, audiophile standard loudspeaker cables and basically debunked them, you know?
yeah.
You know?
There's plenty of studies out there, you know. Yeah,
the amount of money people spend on high, you know, really high end loudspeaker cables, and they're getting no benefit from it.
sure.
It's just amazing.
Well, yeah, I think it's, you know, it's like any hobby, isn't it? You know, it's you know, people who are passionate about it, you know, want to just, you know, really get into it. You know, if they've got money to spend, you know, then why not? You know, sure, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of like, you know, that old analogy about when you're going fishing, you know, and you've got a super fancy carbon fiber rod, you know, and a kind of high-end reel, you know, does that fish, you know when it sees that bit of bait, you know, that it's on the end of this super fancy high-end rig, you know, is it going to change the fish's decision to bite onto it? But hey, you know, there's something out there for everybody, you know, for all sorts of tastes. So yeah.
More coming in.
Okay.
This one I like. Well, I don't like any of the other questions. This one resonates with me. Who else in the speaker vendor field does Jess admire?
Ooh, wow, that is a good one. I mean, many, you know, before I founded my company, you know, I kind of grew up collecting and cannibalizing and, you know, sort of Frankensteining all sorts of different speakers from all sorts of companies. You know, so kind of to look at the kind of old school, you know, I grew up with, you know, old Celestians and Mordant shorts, and, you know, really got into the company Infinity, the American company, who was, you know, kind of long since, you know, kind of folded, been rebought out, been rebranded. You know, I think they're making like sort of budget car speakers now, but they were a company that, you know, Arnie Nudell, the designer, is a guy I really, really respected, because he was actually doing some really interesting research, you know, into the different driver materials and technologies, exploring using things like injection molded graphite for speaker cones, you know, and developing, you know, really quite special and unique planar tweeters, you know, and this was back in the 80s. So a lot of respect for Arnie Nudell. You know, in today's market, there are some, you know, great companies out there. You know, I think I've always had a little bit of a soft spot for ATC, of course, you know, obviously growing up in and spending time in studio environments, you know, you'd see ATCs everywhere. In particular, you know, special mention for the ATC ASM 75S, I think it is, mid-range dome, you know, which Billy Woodman designed. And that's a speaker design that's you know, kind of used in their own products, and more subsequently has been you know, put into production by the wonderful Volt loudspeakers in Dorset, who are a fantastic company that I'm lucky to have the privilege of working with quite closely. And we use that driver in our K100 reference model and the new K200 model as well. And that's always been a very special driver to me. You know, and obviously the Volt radial drivers that I use also are just, you know, phenomenal and on another level. So yeah, there's a lot of respect out there, you know, a lot of great designers doing good work.
Just a point raised on the chat about Infinity. They're still around by Harman now.
There we go.
Cool, thank you. Next up, and further note to that is that they're primarily concentrating on car and marine speakers now.
Oh, marines. I guess fishes need music too.
Of course. Next up, studio engineers are usually worried about speakers that translate well. Do you do anything special to meet that need?
So yeah, with my professional clients, so guys in studios, I'm more often than not working with them directly. So versus, you know, in the high-end domestic sector, it's mostly selling, you know, through dealers and distributors. So you have that sort of disconnect from the client. But with with studio users, more often than not, you know, I'm in there doing the install myself, and would always often, you know, offer the ability to do a bit of tuning just to help, you know, kind of, it could just be a little, you know, resistor value needs bumping up by an ohm or something, just to help the speakers integrate into their space a little better, so that they can, you know, achieve what they're looking for, to help their work translate, which is fundamentally what studio monitors are there to do. You know, they're not there to be kind of enjoyed necessarily, they are there as a tool, and you're, you know, going to be using them to inform your ear when you're making decisions about how it will translate to other spaces. So yeah, there's, you know, so translation obviously is important, and I think, you know, something I've picked up from engineers and producers I've known and, you know, had the chance to work with, is that, you know, for them a lot of it is about, you know, familiarity, knowing their speakers in their room, and, you know, kind of building that relationship with their playback system, you know, where they just know it so intricately, you know, that they just, you know that something's how it's going to translate out of the box once it's out of the studio. So yeah, so I do try and offer a little bit of, you know, tailor tweaking for people that want to really dial out, you know, that last bit of performance for their work.
Okay, perhaps a challenge. Can I listen to your speakers somewhere in the Netherlands? I'm curious how these sound.
I do actually have a couple of, I have some customers in the Netherlands. I don't currently have a distributor in the Netherlands. Yeah, unfortunately, that's one of the European countries we haven't really kind of broken yet. Yeah, it is something that I'm, kind of keen to get up and running. For any countries where we don't have representation, we are able to offer essentially a 30-day extended trial. So if it's going out of the country, you know, you essentially still, you know, purchase the product, but then be entitled to a full refund pending condition report if it gets, you know, if it arrives and it's not what you're looking for. So the Netherlands is one to watch out for.
All right. Back to technical. How do you balance transmission line bass driver with closed mid-range driver?
Okay, getting into the meat and veg of it. Excellent. So if we think about a bass driver in the context of a three-way loudspeaker, we're dealing with content perhaps up to 400, 500 hertz or thereabouts. And obviously, because of the lower frequencies, it's also responsible for reproducing the much longer wavelengths that fall in an area where our ears are naturally a lot less sensitive. You need a lot more, physical exertion from the speaker cone in order to be able to generate those frequencies in a way that sounds balanced to us, with everything else that's going on. Because we've all got this, the Fletcher-Munson curve that I learned about from these guys here many years ago, and so kind of our ears are less efficient in the bass, so you need a big bass driver. That's why you often see these large bass cones that are moving lots of air. And really with a three-way speaker cabinet, particularly like a transmission line, all my speakers are transmission line, you've got this cone that's obviously moving backwards and forwards, and it's generating just as much energy from the rear of the cone as is coming from the front of the cone. And that energy, of course, is equal but also opposite to what's coming from the front, because it's 180 degrees out of phase. So the choice of the designer really is how to manage that rearward energy, and how to kind of harness it and use it in the most productive way, because of course no cabinet, you're not going to hear any bass. Those long wavelengths, those frequencies are just going to sort of wrap around the edges of the driver and cancel out immediately. So you need that cabinet. So for example, in my three-way loudspeaker models, you've got a bass driver loaded into a transmission line cabinet, and that's all the cabinet's doing really, is providing that environment for the for that rearward energy from the cone, from the bass cone, moving up to the mid, using that that very famous 3-inch dome that we mentioned, and of course it is sealed back. Is this a problem? I mean, it isn't, because this dome is performing in kind of really in that really critical area where our ears are so sensitive. It's that sort of John Ward always taught me about the 2 to 5K area where where the intelligibility of speech lies. Our ears are naturally really sensitive there. So this driver is not having to work hard within those frequencies. It's not having to move back and forth kind of really far with high exertion. So there is not a lot of energy from the back to manage. It is just absorbed. I think there's a little kind of sort of chamber, if you like, sort of based in the magnet that just kind of perhaps absorbs some of that rear energy from the back of the cone. But but it's a far cry from the energy that you'd get from the back of a big 12-inch bass driver that really needs a proper enclosure for managing both the front and the back end energy.
Well, I have to just make another comment, is that this is the first time I've ever heard your smaller loudspeakers, because I've heard your original design, that with a large driver and a mid-range and a tweeter, and considerably bigger than that. But I'm really shocked on how great the bass sounds coming out of these little monitors.
Thank you.
And how do you achieve that?
Yeah,
because I've heard lots of speakers that size, but never heard so much bass without having a sub.
Without a sub, yeah. Well, thank you. I always a design goal was with the K300. Was a stand mount that could do bass. And there are several that can. The kind of the secret to it really, with this speaker, it is all about that transmission line. So you're taking that rearward energy from the back of the cone, and you're channeling it away from the cone, and it kind of that energy travels along a long folded path inside the cabinet, which is the transmission line. So it's like a long tunnel or a labyrinth. Of course, it's a two-way, so this driver is crossing over to the tweeter at 2K, so there's a lot of higher frequency content coming from the back of the cone as well. Most of that is absorbed by 2 different types of absorbative damping material inside the cabinet, as it makes its journey around. And then by the time that air has found its way to the front of the speaker, or the terminus of the transmission line, that higher content has all been absorbed, and what you're left with is content below about 80 or 100 hertz or so. And because it's gone along this journey, there is, of course, a physical time delay that's occurring by just enough to allow that energy coming out of the vent to work together with the output from the front of the cone. So you are essentially going through a kind of phase shift there that's, yeah, allowing that rearward energy to work together with the cone over a much wider operating area than you would typically get with a ported loudspeaker or even a lot of sealed loudspeakers. That's really the kind of key benefit of transmission line. You're kind of getting this much more extended bass response that has a more natural and more gradual roll off, with a lot of ported reflex enclosures that are obviously, very commonplace. We often see, very impressive bass response, kind of, but only, down to maybe, sort of 50 hertz or so, 45 hertz, where often you'll kind of reach this point in the spectrum where the bass port is, working, at maximum efficiency, with the cone, and maybe even get a slight little bump in the bass, which can be quite satisfying. But then once you then sort of get out of that territory and the bass port is no longer functioning efficiently and optimally, that's when you can often lose a lot of bass response, and it, can sort of fall off a cliff almost a little bit with smaller speakers. So, it is a challenge to get a transmission line, into a box, that small, and get it to perform and to do bass. But that's just lots of playing around, really, trial and error, and just, yeah, kind of having a go and getting stuck in.
Got two more.
Okay. Cool.
Quite a long time now. Doing
It's very good.
So first one, what software do you use to model the transmission line bass systems?
That's an easy one. I don't use any modeling software. Sorry. Yeah. No, I get my pen and paper out and I draw on, some of the understood principles around transmission line technology, but I've certainly got my own spin on it and got my own way of doing it, really. So there's no modeling.
You do the maths.
Yeah.
And then maybe quite an open one.
Oh yeah.
Do you have views on active versus passive speakers?
Oh, yeah. So that's a good one. Yes, I do. I enjoy both, and I think there's a place for both. There's no question that active speakers have very much become, the accepted norm in professional environments, and also obviously in more consumer-based systems as well. I think it's almost an expectation if you're buying something kind of consumer level, these days, that it's going to have an amp built in and you can just stream to it straight from your phone. And that's one of the other benefits, I guess, that come with active, particularly with the advancements, in kind of, chip technology and DSP, and, we're getting all this increased functionality now, so that an active pair of speakers doesn't always necessarily just mean speakers with an amp built in. Often it means, speakers that do everything. And yeah, obviously, in studio environments, active is sort of generally an expectation, with some exceptions. It's less commonly seen in hi-fi. It is sort of creeping in. There are active fans, and yeah, and I'm personally, I'm quite neutral on it. My speakers are all passive. I do work very closely with Chord Electronics, who supply amplifiers to some of my pro audio customers, so I've got a good working relationship with them. For me, the passive filter networks or crossovers that go into my speakers, I very much see it as the brain of the loudspeaker. That's really where the designer is kind of getting stuck in and putting his own kind of twist on on how he wants his speaker to sound. It's almost like a design language kind of thing. And I have had people who I've, kind of loaned the speakers to, and then, with permission, they've, taken all the drivers out and, connected them to individual amplifiers and built like, a DSP slope, and put their own filters in there for the crossover points, and the results have been great. They've sounded good, but they haven't sounded like my speakers, which, yeah, is kind of a thing, I know, maybe something I need to get over, but no, for me, my design language is to use passive crossovers. Thankfully, that's a view that's supported and upheld actually by Chord, who, as I say, I'm working with for studio installation. They're big advocates of treating the loudspeaker very much as a system, you know, and just feeding it a full range signal that's coming from a really good amplifier that's working full range. So we might see active speakers from Kerr Acoustic in the future. They might stay passive, you know. That's part of the journey I've still got to discover. So hopefully that, yeah, covers that a little bit.
That's perfect. I have called a close to the question.
Thank you for your questions.
All right. Well, I realize that I'm a voice in the middle distance just now, but I am monitoring a laptop which I'm reticent to move away from. So all that remains is words of thanks. So firstly, to Anglia Ruskin Ruskin University for hosting us, to Bill Campbell for organizing the hosting, to Ryan and Mark, the technicians who set us up with all the wonderful equipment that has allowed this to happen, to Archie, our camera person, who has done a wonderful job of making Jess look just as good as he looks in real life. And last but not least, I hope, Jess, thank you so much for a great talk.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
Everyone for joining us online and in person.
Thank you for having me, guys. No, it's been great to be here. Thank you. Cheers.